Don't you ever touch my son." Lincoln's voice was a lethal, icy whisper, his hand dropping seamlessly to the cold steel hidden beneath his tailored cashmere coat. The diner instantly fell dead silent. His men shifted, heavy boots scraping the linoleum, hands drifting to their own holsters. But the waitress, Aurora, didn't flinch. She kept her small, flour-dusted hand gently rested on the little boy's shoulder. The boy, who had lived his entire 4 years in a world of absolute, impenetrable silence, looked up at her and smiled radiantly. "I wasn't hurting him," Aurora said, her voice steady. Her brown eyes locked fearlessly onto the most dangerous man in the city. "I was just saying hello, the only way he can hear it." Lincoln froze, entirely shocked. The city of towering glass and shadowed concrete belonged entirely to Lincoln. He was a man whose mere surname could halt shipments at the docks, clear out crowded restaurants, and make seasoned politicians sweat through their silk collars. From the penthouse of his fortress-like estate, he orchestrated an empire built on fear, precision, and an ironclad code of loyalty. Yet, as he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the relentless gray rain pummel the city streets below, none of his immense power mattered. The cold glass against his knuckles was a sharp reminder of the one fortress he could not breach, the one problem his endless reservoirs of wealth and intimidation could not solve. He turned his gaze inward, away from the weeping city, to the center of his expansive, quiet living room. There, sitting on a priceless, hand-woven Persian rug, was his 4-year-old son, Leo. The boy was meticulously stacking wooden blocks, building a tower with the kind of intense, singular focus that mirrored his father's. As Lincoln watched, the boy's sleeve caught the edge of the wooden structure. The tower collapsed, the heavy wooden blocks crashing against the hardwood floor just off the edge of the rug. It was a loud, startling clatter that caused Lincoln's 2 armed bodyguards standing by the mahogany doors to instinctively flinch. But Leo didn't blink. The boy didn't jump, didn't turn his head, didn't register the chaotic sound of his ruined creation. He simply sat there in the vast, echoing room, entirely enveloped in his absolute, unbreakable silence. Leo had been born profoundly deaf. It was a cruel twist of fate that felt to Lincoln like a cosmic punishment for a lifetime of ruthless deeds. When the doctors had first delivered the news, the sterile, blindingly white hospital room had felt like it was shrinking. Lincoln had immediately mobilized his resources. He had flown in the world's leading audiologists from Switzerland, consulted cutting-edge neurosurgeons in Tokyo, and poured millions into experimental acoustic therapies. He had approached his son's deafness the same way he approached a rival syndicate as an enemy, to be overwhelmed with superior force and capital. But the silence had proven completely invincible. Every specialist had eventually offered the same sympathetic, useless smile, packing up their expensive equipment and leaving Lincoln with a checkbook that was useless against biology. The mother of the boy, a woman whose gentle laughter used to fill the sprawling estate, had passed away during childbirth, leaving Lincoln alone to navigate the terrifying waters of parenthood. He had sworn over her grave to protect their son from everything. He had built a literal empire to keep the boy safe from the violence of the streets, surrounding him with armored vehicles, biometric security systems, and men who would take a bullet without a second thought. But Lincoln felt like a colossal failure. He could protect Leo from bullets, but he couldn't protect him from the agonizing isolation of a soundless world. He watched his son reach for a fallen block, his small face etched with a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. "Get the car," Lincoln ordered suddenly, his voice rough, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. The bodyguard nearest the door nodded sharply, immediately raising a hand to his earpiece. Lincoln couldn't breathe in the penthouse anymore. The luxurious, silent walls felt like a mausoleum. He needed the noise of the city. Even if his son couldn't hear it, he needed the chaotic, unpredictable energy of the streets to distract him from the suffocating guilt that gripped his chest. 10 minutes later, Lincoln was buckling Leo into the reinforced car seat of a massive, armored black SUV. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming a frantic, chaotic rhythm against the bulletproof glass. Lincoln sat beside his son, staring out at the blurred neon lights of the city slipping past. The boy was fascinated by the rain, pressing his small, warm hand against the cold glass, feeling the muffled vibrations of the engine beneath them. Lincoln watched the boy's profile, feeling a familiar, heavy ache in his jaw. He was a man who commanded thousands, whose every spoken word was treated as absolute law, yet he possessed zero ability to communicate with the only person on earth who truly mattered to him. They drove aimlessly through the weeping city, two prisoners trapped inside a mobile fortress of steel and silence, searching out in the dark for a brief, fleeting escape from the crushing weight of their reality. The neon signs reflected in the puddles like shattered glass, leading them toward a destiny they couldn't possibly foresee. The diner on 4th Street existed in a perpetual state of greasy twilight, its ambiance dictated by the flickering, bruised purple neon sign that hummed a relentless electric insect song outside the rain-streaked windows. It was the kind of establishment that catered to the city's insomniacs, the graveyard shift workers, and the ghosts who had nowhere else to haunt. The air inside was impossibly thick, layered with decades of burnt black coffee, industrial-grade bleach, frying onions, and the desperate metallic tang of the city's late-night exhaustion. Behind the cracked Formica counter, standing on feet that felt like they were packed with shattered glass, was Aurora. She was 24, running on 3 hours of fitful sleep, and currently using a damp, bleach-soaked rag to scrub a stubborn coffee ring off a wobbly stool. Aurora's life was a masterclass in quiet, relentless endurance. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy, practical bun, secured with a chipped plastic clip, and her pastel blue waitress uniform was slightly frayed at the cuffs. She moved with the efficient, exhausted grace of someone who had long ago traded their dreams for the necessity of sheer survival. Every tip she earned, every extra shift she agonizingly begged her sweaty, irritable manager for, went directly into a faded manila envelope in her tiny apartment. The envelope was meant to pay off a mountain of medical debt left behind by her younger sister, a sister who had spent the last 5 years of her life in and out of sterile hospital rooms before her heart finally gave out. Aurora carried the grief like a lead weight in her pocket, heavy and constant, but she couldn't afford the luxury of stopping to cry. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed violently, snapping Aurora out of her exhausted reverie. The sound usually heralded a drunk seeking grease or a tired cab driver needing a caffeine fix. But the atmosphere in the diner shifted instantaneously, violently. The ambient noise, the low hum of the ancient refrigerator, the quiet bickering of the elderly couple in booth 3, the clatter of the cook's spatula in the back seemed to evaporate. The temperature in the room plummeted. Aurora looked up from her rag, her instincts immediately flaring. 3 men had walked in. The 2 flanking the door were mountains of muscle draped in dark, ill-fitting raincoats that failed to conceal the heavy, unnatural bulges near their ribs. Their eyes swept the small diner with terrifying, professional efficiency, mentally logging the exits, the patrons, and the blind spots. But it was the man in the center who commanded the oxygen in the room. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that looked entirely alien amidst the cheap vinyl booths and peeling wallpaper. His face was chiseled from cold granite, marked by a small, faded scar near his jawline, and his dark eyes were flat, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. This was Lincoln. Aurora didn't know his name, but she instantly recognized the aura of raw, unmitigated power and danger that radiated off him. He was a predator who had somehow wandered into a cage full of tired mice. The few regulars in the diner immediately put their heads down, suddenly finding their stale apple pie absolutely fascinating. The elderly couple quietly dropped a $10 bill on the table and scurried out the side door into the rain. Aurora swallowed the sudden dry lump in her throat, gripping the wet rag tighter. She told herself to breathe, to just take their order, serve the coffee, and survive the shift. Then she saw the boy. Stepping out from behind the imposing wall of the dark-suited man was a little boy, no older than 4. He was dressed meticulously in a miniature wool coat, his dark hair neatly styled. But what struck Aurora wasn't his expensive clothes. It was his profound, utter detachment from the suffocating tension in the room. While the adults were practically suffocating on the threat of violence, the boy was entirely relaxed. He walked toward a booth, his eyes wide and curious, staring at the spinning pies in the glass dessert case. A massive clap of thunder rattled the large front window, causing Aurora to jump slightly. But the boy didn't even blink. He didn't turn his head. He just continued to stare at a cherry pie. Aurora's breath hitched. She recognized that specific brand of isolation instantly. The boy wasn't just ignoring the noise simply didn't exist for him. He was entirely trapped in a world of silence. Her heart, hardened by grief and exhaustion, suddenly cracked wide open, bleeding an immediate, overwhelming wave of empathy for the small child surrounded by towering, dangerous men. Aurora wiped her hands on her stained apron, forcing her trembling legs to move. She grabbed a fresh order pad and a heavy ceramic coffee pot, walking toward the corner booth where the men had settled. The 2 massive bodyguards remained standing, their eyes tracking her every single micro-movement like targeting lasers. Lincoln slid into the red vinyl booth, his posture rigid, his dark eyes staring blankly at the rain sliding down the window pane. The little boy, Leo, knelt on the seat opposite him, his small hands pressed flat against the cool glass, fascinated by the chaotic distortion of the streetlights outside. "Evening," Aurora said, fighting to keep the tremor out of her voice. She stood a safe distance from the edge of the table. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Lincoln didn't even bother to look at her. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the rainy street. "Black coffee." 2. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Aurora's chest. He waved a dismissive hand toward the men standing guard. "And whatever the kid wants." Aurora nodded slowly, pouring the steaming tar-black coffee into the thick white mugs. The aroma briefly cut through the smell of bleach. She placed a mug in front of Lincoln, then turned her attention to the boy. He was still staring out the window, completely oblivious to her presence. Aurora felt a familiar, sharp pang of sorrow. She remembered her own sister, the long periods of silence, the desperate need to bridge the gap between their 2 worlds. "Hey there, buddy," Aurora said softly, leaning in slightly. She knew he couldn't hear her, but the habit of speaking was ingrained. "Do you want some hot chocolate? Maybe some pancakes?" "Don't bother," Lincoln snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He finally turned his head, his dark, dangerous eyes locking onto Aurora with a terrifying intensity. The look was a mixture of profound exhaustion and simmering, protective rage. "He's deaf. He can't hear a damn word you're saying. Just bring him some milk and a piece of pie." The 2 bodyguards shifted their weight, their heavy leather coats creaking loudly in the tense silence of the diner. It was an unspoken command for Aurora to nod, apologize profusely, and retreat to the safety of her kitchen. Any other waitress in the city would have scrambled away, terrified of angering the man who clearly radiated extreme violence. But Aurora didn't retreat. She didn't apologize. Instead, a stubborn, fierce spark ignited in her chest. She looked at the incredibly wealthy, incredibly dangerous man, and saw only a father who had absolutely no idea how to talk to his own child. She placed her order pad gently into the deep pocket of her apron. Deliberately ignoring Lincoln's hostile glare, she took a step closer to the booth. The bodyguard nearest to her twitched, his hand moving an inch closer to his lapel, but Lincoln held up a single, raised finger, halting the man instantly. He watched the waitress, his eyes narrowing in suspicion and dangerous curiosity. Aurora crouched down, bringing herself completely level with the boy's eye line. She waited patiently until the boy, noticing the movement in his peripheral vision, finally turned his head away from the window to look at her. His big, dark eyes were wide and questioning. Aurora smiled, a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of her tired eyes. She brought her hands up into the space between them. With precise, fluid, and incredibly graceful movements, she formed the shapes. She brought her hand to her forehead, moving it outward in a crisp salute. Hello? Then she pointed to herself, formed the letter A with her right hand, and tapped it against her chin. My name is Aurora. She paused, keeping eye contact, and then mimed holding a cup, swirling her hand above it. Do you want hot chocolate? The transformation in the boy was explosive and instantaneous. His mouth dropped open in absolute, unadulterated shock. He dropped the small wooden toy he had been clutching in his left hand, the toy clattering loudly against the table. For his entire life, adults had just been moving mouths, frustrated expressions, and silent, incomprehensible gestures. Now, suddenly, miraculously, a stranger in a bright, noisy room was speaking his exact language. A massive, brilliant smile broke across Leo's face, illuminating the dark corner of the diner. His small, clumsy hands shot up. He struggled with the dexterity, his fine motor skills still developing, but his intent was fiercely clear. He made a fist, rubbing it in a circle over his chest. Then, mimed drinking. Yes, please. Chocolate. Aurora's smile widened, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Okay, she signed back, making an O and a K. I will bring it. She began to stand up, turning back to the table, completely unprepared for what was waiting for her. Don't you ever touch my son. Lincoln's voice was a lethal, icy whisper, his hand dropping seamlessly to the cold steel hidden beneath his tailored cashmere coat. The diner instantly fell dead silent. His men shifted, heavy boots scraping the linoleum, hands drifting to their own holsters. But Aurora didn't flinch. She kept her small, flour-dusted hand gently rested on the little boy's shoulder. The boy, oblivious to the threat of death hovering in the air, looked up at her and smiled radiantly. I wasn't hurting him, Aurora said, her voice steady, her brown eyes locked fearlessly onto the most dangerous man in the city. I was just saying hello, the only way he can hear it. Lincoln froze, entirely shocked, his hand hovering over his weapon, staring at the waitress who had just effortlessly breached the impregnable fortress around his son. The tension in the diner was so incredibly thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Lincoln's dark eyes were locked onto Aurora, searching her tired, pale face for any sign of deception, any flicker of a hidden agenda. In his dark, violent world, coincidences simply did not exist. Every chance encounter was a potential setup, every smiling stranger, a potential assassin hired by a rival family. The idea that a random minimum-wage waitress in a run-down diner at 2 a.m. just happened to be fluent in American Sign Language was statistically impossible to his paranoid mind. Sit down, Lincoln commanded softly. It wasn't an invitation. It was an absolute directive, carrying the weight of a physical blow. Aurora's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She glanced back toward the kitchen, where the cook was aggressively pretending to scrub a perfectly clean grill, completely ignoring the volatile situation. She had no backup, no escape route. Slowly, her hands shaking slightly, she slid into the vinyl booth opposite Lincoln. Sitting right beside the little boy who was now happily swinging his legs, oblivious to the deadly undercurrents swirling around him, the two bodyguards immediately stepped closer, boxing the booth in, turning their massive bodies to block the view of the street. Aurora felt entirely trapped in a cage with a sleeping tiger that had just opened one yellow eye. "Who sent you?" Lincoln asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but vibrating with lethal intent. He leaned forward, invading her space, smelling of expensive cologne, rain, and cold metal. "Which family? The Morettis? The Russians? Who told you to learn that hand trick to get close to my boy?" Aurora stared at him, genuine confusion wrinkling her forehead, quickly followed by a spark of pure, indignant anger. "Nobody sent me," she snapped back, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror pooling in her stomach. "I work 45 hours a week here, serving lukewarm coffee and rubbery eggs to people who don't tip. Do I look like a mob spy to you?" Lincoln's jaw muscles feathered. "You knew he was deaf. You knew exactly how to talk to him. People don't just know that. Not people like you. People like me," Aurora echoed, the anger sharpening her tone, completely overriding her fear of the gun she knew was hiding under his coat. "You mean poor people? Working-class people? No, you're right, mister. We don't get special tutors. We learn things because life forces us to." She broke eye contact with him, looking down at her hands. They were rough, calloused, the cuticles dry from industrial dish soap. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a profound, old sorrow. "My little sister, Maya," Aurora began, her voice dropping to a soft, heartbreaking register. "She lost her hearing to a high fever when she was 3. The doctors said the infection damaged the nerves, irreversible." She looked up, her brown eyes locking onto Lincoln's, letting him see the naked, raw grief swimming there. "We didn't have the money for fancy private schools or experimental treatments. We had the public library and a community center. I learned sign language every night after school so my sister wouldn't have to live trapped inside her own head. I learned it so I could tell her I loved her when the world went completely silent." Lincoln stared at her. He had spent his entire adult life interrogating men, breaking them down, deciphering truth from lies, while staring down the barrel of a gun. He was a human lie detector, and looking at the exhaustion, the pain, and the fierce, protective love radiating from this frail woman in a stained uniform, he knew with absolute certainty that she was telling the absolute truth. The paranoia that had gripped his chest slowly evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow vacuum of immense guilt. He, a man of infinite resources, a man who could buy entire city blocks with a single phone call, had spent millions trying to fix his son, trying to make him normal. He had hired experts to cure the silence, but he had never once humbled himself enough to simply learn the language of the silence itself. He had viewed sign language as a surrender, a crutch, a failure. He looked away from Aurora, turning his gaze to his son. Leo was looking at Aurora, his small hands resting on the table, a look of desperate, hopeful anticipation on his face, waiting for the wonderful woman to make the magical shapes with her hands again. Lincoln felt a lump form in his throat, thick and suffocating. He slowly removed his hand from the inside of his coat, resting it flat on the scratched formica table. The threat of violence dissipated, replaced by a heavy, vulnerable silence. I never learned, Lincoln confessed, his voice incredibly soft, stripped of all its authority and menace. It was the admission of a defeated father, not a mob boss. They told me it would hinder his speech therapy, that if he learned to sign, he would never try to talk. So, I forbade it in the house. I thought I was protecting him. Aurora's anger melted instantly, replaced by a wave of profound sympathy. She saw the crushing weight of regret pressing down on the powerful man's shoulders. "You were listening to doctors who treat deafness as a disease," she said gently. "It's not a disease. It's just a different way of experiencing the world. He doesn't need to be fixed. He just needs to be heard." Lincoln looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The exhausted, underpaid waitress had just shattered his entire worldview with a few graceful movements of her hands and a dose of terrifying honesty. The diner around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the profound, silent revelation hovering over the cheap vinyl booth. The heavy rain continued to batter the diner's large front windows, casting distorted, watery shadows across the faded linoleum floor. The intense standoff in the booth had dissolved into a fragile, unprecedented peace. Lincoln sat back, the rigid lines of his posture softening slightly as he watched Aurora interact with his son. He had ordered the bodyguards to stand down, and they had retreated to the front door, though their eyes remained vigilant, scanning the dark street outside. Aurora had returned from the kitchen, carrying a large porcelain mug of steaming hot chocolate, piled impossibly high with whipped cream and a thick slice of cherry pie. She slid them carefully in front of Leo. The boy's eyes lit up. He looked up at Aurora, his small hands coming together, the right hand brushing the back of the left in a clumsy but unmistakable gesture. "Thank you." Aurora smiled brightly, tapping her fingers to her chin and bringing her hand down. "You're welcome." Lincoln watched the silent exchange, a sharp pang of jealousy twisting in his gut. His son was communicating, expressing gratitude, forming a connection, and Lincoln was entirely locked out of the conversation. He was a spectator in his own child's life. Aurora noticed the dark cloud passing over Lincoln's face. She wiped her hands on her apron, an idea sparking in her mind. "Has he ever listened to music?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet rumble of the diner. Lincoln looked at her as if she had just asked if the boy could fly. "He's profoundly deaf, Aurora. The nerves are completely dead. He can't hear a jet engine if he was standing on the runway." The bitterness had returned to his voice, a defense mechanism against the pain. "I didn't ask if he could hear it," Aurora corrected gently, stepping out of the booth. "I asked if he had ever listened to it. There is a very big difference." She didn't wait for his permission. She walked over to Leo, crouching down and holding out her hand. She smiled, tapping her ear, then pointing toward the corner of the diner. Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing at his father. Lincoln, entirely bewildered but captivated by the waitress's bizarre confidence, gave a microscopic nod. Leo took Aurora's hand, sliding out of the booth. Aurora led the boy to the far corner of the diner, where a massive, vintage Wurlitzer jukebox stood in the shadows. It was a beautiful, hulking machine of polished mahogany, gleaming chrome, and neon tubes that pulsed with a warm, nostalgic glow. She reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a silver quarter, and dropped it into the slot. The machine accepted the coin with a heavy, mechanical clunk. She pressed a combination of heavy plastic buttons. Deep inside the machine, gears whirred. A mechanical arm selected a heavy vinyl record, and the needle dropped with an audible crackle. Aurora didn't step back. Instead, she knelt behind Leo, gently placing both of his small, soft hands flat against the wooden side panels of the jukebox, right over the massive internal subwoofers. Suddenly, The diner was filled with the sounds of a heavy, driving blues track. It wasn't a soft, melodic tune. It was a song built on a thick, rolling bass line and the explosive crash of heavy drums. The sheer volume of it made the coffee cups on the tables vibrate. At the exact moment the bass kicked in, Leo gasped. His entire body went rigid. He wasn't hearing the music through his ears. He was feeling it travel through the solid mahogany, up his arms, and directly into his chest cavity. The rhythmic, powerful vibrations were a physical force, a tangible entity wrapping around him. Aurora kept her hands gently over his, pressing them against the wood. She began to tap her fingers against his knuckles, perfectly matching the heavy, driving beat of the blues rhythm. With her other hand, she signed in front of his face. The gesture for music, her arm swinging back and forth like a conductor, and the gesture for feel, her middle finger drawing up her chest. Leo's eyes went wider than Lincoln had ever seen them. The boy turned his head, looking back at his father, sitting in the booth. And then, a smile broke across Leo's face. It wasn't just a smile. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated joy. He began to laugh, a silent, breathy giggle that shook his small shoulders. He started to bounce on his heels, his hands pressed firmly to the vibrating wood, entirely synchronized with the heavy rhythm of the song. He was dancing. Lincoln sat perfectly frozen in the vinyl booth, his breath caught in his throat, his chest tight and aching. He watched his son, a boy who had been locked in a silent prison since birth, suddenly bursting with the sheer physical ecstasy of music. He saw the waitress, her eyes closed, smiling as she tapped the rhythm onto the boy's hands, acting as a human conduit between the silence and the sound. A single hot tear escaped Lincoln's eye, tracing a path down his scarred cheek before he could quickly wipe it away. He was a man who possessed millions of dollars, a fleet of armored cars, and an army of ruthless men. He had moved heaven and earth, hired the brightest minds on the planet, all to bring his son an ounce of happiness, and he had failed entirely. Yet here, in a run-down, grease-stained diner, at 2 a.m, an exhausted waitress with a 25-cent coin had just given his son the entire world. For the first time in his violent, calculated life, Lincoln felt entirely humbled. He realized that true power wasn't about dominating a room. It was about the ability to unlock a heart. He watched Aurora, the neon lights painting her in vibrant colors, and realized she was the most valuable person he had ever met. The heavy blues track continued to pulse through the diner, the driving bass line masking the dangerous sounds of the city outside. By the jukebox, Leo was still laughing his silent, joyous laugh, his hands firmly planted against the vibrating mahogany, his small body swaying to the rhythm Aurora tapped out on his knuckles. In the booth, Lincoln watched them, a profound, uncharacteristic warmth spreading through his chest. The heavy, protective armor he wore constantly had slipped, revealing the terrified, loving father underneath. For a fleeting, beautiful minute, the violent world of the Mafia, the rivalries, and the constant threat of death were a million miles away. Then, reality tore violently through the illusion. It started not with a sound, but with a blinding flash of light. The twin high beams of a black, unlit SUV suddenly flooded the diner, slicing through the darkness of the rainy street and illuminating the interior with the harsh intensity of a spotlight. Lincoln's survival instincts, honed by decades of urban warfare, engaged before his conscious mind even registered the threat. The warmth in his chest evaporated, replaced instantly by the freezing rush of adrenaline. He didn't think. He reacted. "Get down!" Lincoln roared, his voice tearing through the music as he lunged violently out of the booth, his hand already drawing the heavy, black, semi-automatic pistol from beneath his coat. A fraction of a second later, the front of the diner exploded inward. The massive plate glass window, previously streaked with quiet rain, shattered into a million lethal, glittering projectiles under a sustained barrage of automatic weapons fire. The deafening staccato roar of the assault rifles drowned out the blues track instantly. The neon sign above the door exploded in a shower of sparks and purple gas. Chunks of plaster, vinyl, and hot lead tore through the diner's interior, shredding the booths, exploding the coffee pots, and filling the air with a blinding cloud of drywall dust and the acrid metallic smell of cordite. Lincoln hit the floor hard, glass raining down on his back. His two bodyguards had already drawn their weapons and were returning fire blindly through the shattered window, their handguns barking sharply against the overwhelming roar of the rifles outside. "Leo!" Lincoln screamed, the sheer terror in his voice cracking his throat. He scrambled on his stomach, crawling over overturned chairs and slick, wet linoleum, desperately trying to see through the thick, choking smoke. His eyes locked onto the corner where the jukebox stood. The heavy mahogany machine was taking heavy fire, the wood splintering, the glass front shattering as bullets tore through its inner mechanisms. The music died with a violent, screeching electronic wail. Lincoln's heart completely stopped. The space in front of the jukebox was empty. Panic, absolute and paralyzing, gripped him. He pushed himself up onto his knees, completely ignoring the bullets snapping through the air inches above his head, frantically scanning the ruins of the diner. "Leo!" he roared again, his voice breaking. Through the thick haze of plaster dust, behind the heavy, reinforced oak of the front service counter, he saw movement. Aurora hadn't frozen when the glass shattered. In the split second, the high beams flooded the room. Before the first bullet had even struck the window, her instincts, honed not by war, but by a fierce, protective maternal drive, had taken over. She had violently tackled Leo to the ground, wrapping her body entirely around his, and rolled them both behind the solid oak counter just as the airspace where they had been standing was shredded by gunfire. Lincoln crawled frantically toward the counter, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his cheek. He threw himself behind the heavy oak structure, sliding across the slippery floor until he crashed into them. Aurora was curled into a tight ball, her back pressed against the wood, her arms locked fiercely around the boy. She was covered in white plaster dust and shattered glass. A jagged piece of shrapnel had torn a bloody gash across her shoulder, soaking the pale blue sleeve of her uniform in dark crimson blood. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. Her face was inches from Leo's. The boy was terrified, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. He couldn't hear the deafening roar of the guns, but he could feel the terrifying, violent concussions shaking the floor beneath him, the shock waves of the explosions jarring his small bones. Aurora was holding his gaze, absolutely refusing to look away. Despite her bleeding shoulder, despite the chaos and death occurring just feet away, her hands were moving. She was signing rapidly, repeatedly, her face locked in an expression of absolute, unwavering calm. "Look at me. Look at me," she signed, her fingers trembling but precise. "You are safe. I am here. We are safe." She pressed her hand firmly against his chest, right over his racing heart, and then brought it to her own chest. "Breathe. With me." Lincoln knelt there in the dust and the noise, watching a bleeding, minimum-wage waitress shield his son with her own flesh, keeping the terrified boy anchored to reality through the silent language of her hands. He realized then, with absolute certainty, that all his money, all his power, and all his armed men were useless. In the exact moment it mattered most, it was Aurora who had saved his son's life. The deafening roar of automatic weapons fire ended as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by the screeching of tires as the rival SUV tore away into the rainy night. The sudden silence that fell over the ruined diner was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. The air was thick with gray smoke, pulverized drywall, and the sharp, metallic stench of blood and gunpowder. The only sounds remaining were the chaotic hissing of a ruptured espresso machine, the gentle patter of rain falling freely through the destroyed front window, and the ragged, adrenaline-fueled breathing of the survivors. Lincoln remained crouched tightly behind the heavy oak counter, his pistol gripped so fiercely his knuckles were white, his dark eyes frantically scanning the wreckage. "Clear?" he barked, his voice raw and echoing in the shattered room. "Clear, boss," one of his bodyguards coughed, stepping out from behind an overturned booth. His coat was shredded, but he was reloading his weapon with cold, mechanical efficiency. The other guard was already moving to the back door to secure the perimeter. They had survived, but the diner was an absolute slaughterhouse of broken glass and ruined vinyl. Lincoln dropped his weapon to the floor, the heavy thud barely registering. He turned his attention immediately back to the corner, behind the counter. Aurora was still curled over Leo. She was breathing heavily, her face pale beneath a thick layer of white plaster dust. The sleeve of her pastel blue uniform was completely soaked in dark, wet crimson, the blood dripping steadily from the deep shrapnel gash on her shoulder and pooling on the cracked linoleum floor. Yet, her focus was entirely unbroken. She was still looking directly into Leo's eyes, her uninjured hand resting gently on his cheek, her thumb wiping away a stray tear. She signed slowly, deliberately. All done. Safe now. Leo stared at her, his small body trembling violently. He couldn't hear the destruction, but he felt the trauma vibrating in the air. He reached out with shaking hands and clumsily signed back. "Hurt?" He pointed a small, shaking finger at her bleeding arm. Aurora forced a weak, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She shook her head. "Small scratch. I am okay." Lincoln felt his chest constrict so tightly, he thought his ribs might snap. He reached out, his large, scarred hands gently grasping Aurora's uninjured arm. "Let me see," he commanded softly. The Mafia boss persona entirely gone, leaving only a desperate, incredibly grateful man. He gently pulled her away from the boy, inspecting the wound. It was deep, bleeding sluggishly, requiring immediate stitches, but the artery wasn't hit. She had taken the shrapnel entirely on her own back, shielding Leo completely. He looked at his son, who was miraculously untouched. Not a single scratch on his small body, perfectly preserved inside the cocoon Aurora had created with her own flesh. Lincoln looked back up at Aurora. The exhaustion, the blood loss, and the sudden drop in adrenaline were catching up to her. Her eyes were fluttering, losing focus, her head swaying slightly. "Hey, look at me," Lincoln said, his voice surprisingly gentle, keeping his hand firmly on her arm to steady her. "You're going to be fine. I'm getting you out of here." He turned his head over his shoulder. "Marco, bring the car around to the alley. Now, call the doctor. Tell him to meet us at the safe house. We have a bleeder." Aurora blinked heavily, trying to process his words through the ringing in her ears. "No," she mumbled weakly, trying to pull her arm away. "I can't. I have to clean up. The manager. He'll dock my pay. I don't have insurance for a hospital." Lincoln stared at her in absolute disbelief. She was bleeding out on the floor of a destroyed diner, having just survived an assassination attempt, and she was worried about her minimum wage shift and medical bills. The fierce, stubborn resilience of the woman astounded him. Without another word, Lincoln slid his arms under her knees and behind her back, lifting her effortlessly off the bloody floor. Aurora gasped in pain, but she was too weak to fight him. As he stood up, he looked down at Leo. He didn't need to speak. He looked his son in the eyes, extending his hand. Leo immediately grasped his father's fingers tightly, his small face pale but trusting. "You're not going to a hospital, and you're never working in this diner again," Lincoln told Aurora, his voice a low, rumbling vow as he carried her through the wreckage toward the back door. It wasn't a threat, it was an absolute guarantee. "You're coming with me, both of you." He carried the bleeding waitress out into the cold, pouring rain, his son clinging tightly to his coat, walking away from the shattered glass and the violent life that had almost claimed them, stepping toward a profoundly uncertain future. The sterile smell of medical alcohol and iodine clashed sharply with the rich, heavy scent of old money, polished mahogany, and leather. Aurora lay propped up on plush silk pillows in a massive, sprawling guest suite, located deep within Lincoln's heavily fortified estate. Her left shoulder was tightly bound in thick, white medical gauze, throbbing with a dull, persistent ache that the high-grade painkillers the private doctor had administered were only barely managing to blunt. She stared around the room in overwhelming disbelief. The walls were covered in intricate silk wallpaper. The furniture was heavy, antique, and clearly priceless, and the windows were thick, bulletproof glass overlooking a sprawling, manicured garden illuminated by security spotlights. It was a gilded cage, a fortress built by a man whose life was dictated by the constant threat of immense violence. It was a universe away from her cramped, drafty, one-bedroom apartment with the leaky faucet and the pile of overdue bills on the counter. The heavy oak door clicked open softly. Lincoln stepped into the room. He had changed out of his ruined suit and was now wearing a simple, dark cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. Without the heavy coat and the imminent threat of a shootout, he looked less like a terrifying mob boss and more like an incredibly exhausted, deeply burdened man. He carried a silver tray holding a glass of water and a small white pill. He walked to the side of the bed, setting the tray on the ornate nightstand. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, his dark eyes studying her pale face, taking in the bruised exhaustion under her eyes and the stark white bandage contrasting with her skin. The silence in the room wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence he usually felt around his son. It was a cautious, heavy atmosphere of a man calculating his next, unprecedented move. "The doctor said the stitches will hold," Lincoln finally spoke, his deep voice subdued in the quiet room. "No permanent nerve damage. You'll have a scar, but you'll recover completely. Thank you," Aurora said quietly, her voice raspy. She shifted slightly, grimacing against the pull of the stitches. "For the doctor. I know I can't afford this." Lincoln's jaw tightened. He reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of parchment paper. He laid it gently on the silk blankets over her lap. It was a cashier's check, drawn from a private offshore account. The number written on it was so astronomically large, with so many trailing zeros, that Aurora's brain entirely failed to process it for a few seconds. It was enough money to pay off her sister's medical debts 10 times over, buy a house in the safest neighborhood in the city, and never have to smell burnt diner coffee again for the rest of her natural life. "That is for tonight," Lincoln said, his tone entirely businesslike, though a current of desperation ran underneath it. "For saving my boy. But it's also a signing bonus." Aurora dragged her eyes away from the staggering number and looked up at him, confusion furrowing her brow. "A signing bonus? For what?" Lincoln pulled up a heavy, velvet-lined chair and sat down beside the bed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I want you to stay here. In this house, I will double whatever you were making at the diner. Tax-free. Paid. Weekly. You will have your own suite, a car, whatever you need. I want you to be Leo's full-time tutor, his governess. I want you to teach him that language." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper, exposing the raw vulnerability he kept hidden from the world. "I want you to be his voice, Aurora stared at the incredibly powerful man sitting before her. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the absolute willingness to throw vast amounts of wealth at a problem he couldn't solve with a gun. She looked down at the check, feeling the heavy, undeniable pull of financial security, the sudden, miraculous erasure of all her crushing, suffocating debt. It would be so incredibly easy to take it, to become an employee, to live in luxury, and teach the sweet little boy how to navigate his silent world. Slowly, her hands trembling slightly from the painkillers and the sheer audacity of what she was about to do, Aurora picked up the incredibly valuable piece of paper. She looked at Lincoln, her brown eyes hardening with a stubborn, fierce resolve that had nothing to do with money. Deliberately, she tore the heavy check cleanly in half, and then in half again, letting the ruined pieces fall softly onto the silk blanket. Lincoln sat back, utterly stunned. Nobody in his entire, violent life had ever refused his money. Men had killed for a fraction of what was written on that paper. "I don't want your money," Aurora said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "And I am not going to be your son's voice, Lincoln. He doesn't need my voice." She leaned forward, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in her shoulder, holding the dangerous man's gaze without a single ounce of fear. "He needs your voice. He needs his father to stop hiding behind his money, his bodyguards, and his excuses. Paying a stranger to talk to your son is the coward's way out." The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it might violently snap. Lincoln stared at the torn pieces of the check, the word coward echoing in his ears. It was an insult that would usually guarantee a man a shallow grave in the woods. But coming from the bruised, exhausted woman who had just bled for his son, it didn't feel like an insult. It felt like the absolute, devastating truth. Lincoln didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He slowly lowered his head into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking slightly. The impenetrable walls of the Mafia boss finally, completely crumbling, leaving only a broken father desperate to learn how to speak. 3 agonizing, transformative weeks passed inside the heavily fortified walls of the estate. The sprawling, silent mansion had slowly begun to shift, entirely altered by the subtle, persistent presence of Aurora. She hadn't left. She had accepted a room, but she had fundamentally refused a salary, insisting she was there only until Lincoln no longer needed her. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the mob boss's home had been pierced by the quiet, dedicated work of building a bridge across an impossible chasm. The library, a massive, echoing room lined with thousands of unread, leather-bound books, had been entirely repurposed. The heavy mahogany table was now permanently covered in flashcards, illustrated charts, and anatomical diagrams of hand positions. This was where the true, grueling work occurred. Lincoln, a man whose hands were brutally scarred, thickened by decades of fighting, gripping weapons, and breaking bones, found himself engaged in the most incredibly frustrating, difficult battle of his entire life. He sat at the table, his forehead beaded with sweat, his massive jaw clenched in absolute concentration. Across from him sat Aurora, her arm out of the sling but still moving stiffly, demonstrating the shapes with endless, infuriating patience. "No, your thumb needs to tuck in," Aurora corrected gently, leaning across the table to physically mold Lincoln's thick, clumsy fingers into the correct position. "If you leave it out, you're not saying hungry, you're saying angry. And trust me, Leo gets confused when you tell him you're angry for pancakes." Lincoln let out a long, frustrated breath, blowing a stray lock of dark hair out of his eyes. He forced his stiff, calloused fingers to comply, repeating the gesture. It was humiliating, exhausting work, His brain, wired for split-second tactical decisions and complex financial schemes, struggled immensely with the delicate, highly expressive nuances of visual language. He felt foolish, clumsy, and entirely inadequate. But every time he wanted to violently sweep the flashcards off the table and quit, he looked up and saw Leo watching them from the doorway, his dark eyes wide with cautious, fragile hope. And Lincoln would swallow his massive pride, take a deep breath, and raise his scarred hands again. The breakthrough didn't happen in the library. It didn't happen during a structured lesson with flashcards. It happened in the quiet, vulnerable space between day and night. It was late evening. The rain had returned, a soft, rhythmic drumming against the thick window panes of Leo's bedroom. The room was softly lit by a small, rotating nightlight that cast slow-moving stars across the ceiling. Leo was tucked under a heavy duvet, his dark eyes heavy with sleep, clutching a worn stuffed bear. Usually, this was the moment Lincoln dreaded most. The bedtime routine had always been a stark, agonizing reminder of the barrier between them. He would usually just stand awkwardly in the doorway, offer a stiff nod, turn out the light, and leave the boy to the absolute silence. Tonight, however, Lincoln walked fully into the room. He didn't stop at the foot of the bed. He walked around to the side, lowering his massive frame to sit gently on the edge of the mattress. The springs creaked softly under his weight. Leo looked up, instantly sensing the change in routine. He blinked sleepily, watching his father closely. Aurora stood quietly in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her chest. She held her breath, watching the massive, dangerous man she had called a coward prepare to do the bravest thing he had ever done. Lincoln looked down at his son. He felt the familiar, crushing weight of the silence. But this time, he didn't let it defeat him. He took a slow, deep, shuddering breath. He raised his large, heavily scarred hands into the warm, dim light of the room. His hands were shaking, trembling not from the residual adrenaline of a gunfight, but from the immense, terrifying emotional weight of the moment. He moved his fingers deliberately, fighting past the stiffness, past the fear of looking foolish, past years of immense guilt and distance. He pointed directly to his own chest. I. He crossed his massive, muscular arms over his heart, squeezing tightly, his face reflecting the profound, aching depth of the emotion. Love. He uncrossed his arms, pointing a thick, scarred finger directly at the boy. You. He brought his hand up to his forehead, then brought it down, mimicking the rocking of a baby. My son. I. Love. You, my son. The signs were slow. They were undeniably clumsy. The syntax wasn't perfect, but they were the most beautiful, powerful movements Lincoln had ever made in his entire life. Leo lay perfectly still for a second, his dark eyes wide, absorbing the impossible sight of his terrifying, distant father. Finally stepping into his world, the boy's lip quivered. A brilliant, tearful smile broke across his face, illuminating the shadowy room. He pulled his hands out from under the heavy duvet. His small, incredibly precise fingers moved in a rapid, fluid blur of absolute joy. He pointed to his father. He crossed his arms over his chest. He signed the word, for Dad. I love you, Dad. Lincoln's breath hitched violently. The impenetrable dam he had built around his heart, finally, completely shattered. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, spilled over his eyelashes, tracking down his scarred cheeks. He reached out, pulling his son into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in the boy's dark hair. For the first time in 4 years, the silence in the room wasn't heavy or terrifying. It was entirely full. It was vibrating with a love so profound it didn't require a single sound. Lincoln eventually pulled back, wiping his wet face with the back of his massive hand. He looked up toward the doorway. Aurora was standing there, silent tears streaming freely down her own face. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Lincoln looked at her, his dark eyes communicating a debt of gratitude that all the money in his vast empire could never, ever repay. She hadn't just saved his son from the bullets in the diner. She had saved them both from the agonizing, silent prison they had built around themselves. She had taught the most dangerous man in the city how to finally put down his weapons and how to speak with his hands. In the end, the most dangerous man in the city discovered that true, unbreakable power wasn't found in the cold grip of a gun, the absolute fear of his enemies, or the vastness of his bank accounts. True power was found in the immense courage it took to step into another person's world, to embrace the terrifying vulnerability of love, and to learn that the loudest, most profound messages we ever send are often spoken in absolute silence. If Lincoln and Aurora's emotional journey moved you, please hit the like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder about the incredible power of connection, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, real-life, cinematic stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below what you would have done in Aurora's shoes when she first saw the boy in the diner.